everyone, welcome to Type Talks. Today we're here with Katherine Hirsh again, and we're here to talk about the INTP and INTJ dynamic. Katherine has had a father with INTJ preferences. She has some really great stories or illustrations to help you understand these two types and how they get along or how they contrast with each other, to just give you type in action. And so thank you, Katherine, for coming on again.
My pleasure, Joyce. And my father, as you said, had preferences for INTJ. And one of the things that was very interesting in the dynamic was that people often thought, well, there's not a big difference. Because if you look at it in MBTI terms, particularly since the last letter is the dimension that Isabel Myers added, it's not in Jung's original typology, people often tend to think it's not as important. And in fact, what they're missing is that Myers included it as a pointer to the dominant function and what is used in the external world. So perceiving preference, like mine, INTP, points to using a perceiving function, intuition, in the extroverted world, and a judging preference, like my father's, points to using a judging function, in his case, thinking, in the external world. And so what we look like to other people is perhaps almost opposite to what you might anticipate. So I'm looking like intuition is going to be top of the stack for me, and he's looking like thinking is going to be top of the stack for him, because that's what other people see. And my mother gave me a really nice way to think about what introverted functions are like. And that is, it's like a fur coat where the fur, and let's pretend it's faux fur here, is worn on the inside. So it's not out there flashy where everyone can see, but it's inside, glowing and warming that person at the heart of who they are. And so if you looked at my father and his go get 'em, let's plan things, let's organize all of these events, you picked up both the extroverted thinking and the judging preference. And if you looked at my, let's think about this, let's ponder new ways of doing it, let's try something, you would definitely see the intuition and all of this stimulation impacting me, and then my pinging off on that to come up with something different. And when you really got down to it, though, my thinking preference being introverted kept me very grounded in the actual world. And probably my extroversion being linked to intuition also made sure that the visions, so to speak, I was having had something to do with the world, because it was that extroverted subject that drew my attention and got me going. Whereas for him, it was that introverted subject, something personal and unique to him, that got his intuition going. And I'll give you an example. We went to Tanzania together in order to climb Kilamanjaro. And we're on our last day before we're going to summit. And we very carefully chose a trip that would make this a very slow process, because we'd heard that lots of people didn't make it to the top because they tried to ascend too quickly and had problems with altitude sickness. And so I felt awful. I'd been at altitude previously and hadn't had a great deal of trouble. This time I was sick to my stomach, and we're getting set up, and I actually threw up, and I said, "Can you take a picture of this?" And he looked at me like, "Are you crazy?" And I said, "No, I want to remember what this experience entailed. This was a big deal, getting this far working through this and wanting to get to the top. And he complied because he was my dad and a good guy. And he could see it was really meaningful and important to me. And later on, when we were talking about the day and what we'd be doing, being at the top, and I actually have a picture of him here at the top of Kilamanjaro to remember how significant this trip was. He says, well, what should we do next? Should we think about summiting the highest peak on another continent? Should we think about doing 14ers in Colorado? And I'm thinking, we haven't even gotten to the top yet. Why don't we enjoy what's happening now? There's a glacier here that perhaps, this was 2006, so perhaps even now has receded to the point where people aren't experiencing it in the same way we were there. We were with other people. And his introverted intuition already had him off and running on what we could do next. And it really struck me as a difference between the two of us that I then was able to review other things in our lives. So when I was trying to find out, could I leave high school early to go to college? And he'd been very, very interested in my attending the school where he was an alum. And he did a bunch of research to find out whether I could still go there. And I said, I want someplace I can get into now. What do I have to do to get you to focus on me right here in the present moment? And take into consideration how unhappy I am at high school, and how when I went in to express my concerns, the counselor's first thought was, oh, are you complaining about this particular teacher? To which I said, no, it's clear to me that she can't teach to the level she'd like to because the other students are not as interested and engaged. I'd love to have a class one-on-one with her. And the moment where he jumped ahead to what was next, and I wanted to stay thinking about possibilities that were much more immediate, it really brought home differences that I don't think, looking at simply the type code without knowledge of functions and dominance and the degree to which things are conscious, the degree to which they're either introverted or extroverted, and what that draws you to. I wouldn't have been able then to do that review of some of our past experiences that had been extremely difficult for both of us. It must have been awful for someone with INTJ preferences to hear that his child, who he'd encouraged in all of her academic endeavors. In fact, when I was in third grade, he bought me the sixth grade book so that I could read ahead and wouldn't be as bored, is saying, I want to jump off this track. I don't need to get a high school degree. And in fact, just to show you how contrary I am, I seriously considered not completing my undergraduate degree because I knew you didn't need that to get a PhD. But luckily, better sense prevailed, and I went ahead and got that credential. Although to this day, I still don't have a high school degree. So if there's a job that requires that, I have nothing I can put down. I have to rest on my additional qualifications.
You were able to question, is it appropriate for me to get a high school education? And so you didn't follow that almost linear vision that your father had for you, and that could have stressed him out because he's like, what are you doing? I can't understand the logic of, because your logic is more internal, so it makes sense, but it's not being voiced out loud. So to someone looking at you, it's like, what's happening? I don't get it. It looks unpredictable. But it all made sense, and you got your doctorate in an unconventional way that you figured out made more sense for you. So it almost shows how your logic is more internal and his is more external in that sense, because he's like, all right, here's this way that you can get from A to B. And he's like, you're not doing that A to B. Okay.
And I like that you brought in the fact that it might be baffling to someone that there is a logic at all. Because one of the things that I think is really interesting about the external letters in the type code is that many people think, well, introversion and perceiving, those people are going to be really flexible. And extroversion and judging, those people are going to be very rigid. And in many ways, the exact opposite is true. So people with a preference for extroversion and judging are always taking in information about what's happening in the world right now, the actual world in front of us, evaluating it in thinking terms or feeling terms, and then they make a decision. You give them new information a few minutes, days, years later, they're very eager to make a new decision in that moment and start implementing it. You take the IPs, who are spending a lot of time internally processing via thinking or feeling. In all that time that's taken, they become extremely committed to the value, the principle, the set of reasons that has motivated them. And they can be the most dug in, stubborn, inflexible people that you'll ever want to meet. And it's one of the things that I find so fascinating about type is by continuing to explore, peeling back this onion, you actually learn things not only about yourself and others, but you learn things about what it actually means to make a decision. So for me, a decision is something that's going to need to stand up basically for all time. So we were talking before about criticizing something. I will often have a lengthy internal dialogue about whether something is worth criticizing, if it's something I care about enough that I will set up a precedent or put it out there into the world and take the risk that the other person will be upset with me. And many times I've waited far too long because I've judged that it's not going to be eternally important whether the toilet paper roll unfolds this way or that way. Another area on which my father and I disagreed, and every time I was at his house, in the bathroom that was in the guest area, I would always swap it around. Because to me, logically, if there were no children, it should go in the easiest way for you to get it out. And for him, because he kept the way of doing it since we were small children that avoided us or our pets pulling out a whole lot of toilet paper and making a terrible mess when we weren't coordinated or thoughtful enough to do it differently. He just maintained that position because no one had convinced him that there was a better way of doing it. He didn't see a need to change. Sorry, that's maybe a crazy aside. I don't know. But back to the TI versus TE. TI oftentimes is so internal and so much like an autofocus camera for me that someone else has to ask me questions for me to know just what it is that has guided me. And I never got that impression from my father. With the extroverted TE, there was always something, either something he'd created, a document. He was an attorney, so putting things in writing really felt comfortable and natural for him. Or there was something he could look at in the structure of the room. He put that table there so that he'd have to pass by it, and so that he could then put things on it that he had to remember that he was going to take to the next room. And he used the structure of the world to prompt him to follow what he thought was the most logical course. And so that was actually a good lesson for me, that I could use the external world, which I generally use to get ideas to fire up my intuition, also to help structure my thinking.
Yeah, and I think that's perfectly put. For the EJs, they can be very flexible in terms of they make a decision right now, but if they have new incoming information, they'll immediately change their decision and then implement the new thing. Whereas for the IP, they might be mulling over that thought for a very long time, but once they arrived at that conclusion that they've decided on, it is a very firm, almost rigid at times conclusion, and it feels like it has to be true of all time in a way too. It's almost like the introverted functions almost want some timelessness in terms of how they process. It's interesting to see how you and your father would have such different thought processes. And so, do you notice any areas of overlap between you both, where there were similarities?
I, I would say there were definitely some things that us having in common preferences for intuition and thinking, even though they're in opposite attitudes in both of our type codes. So, for instance, before we went on that trip to climb Kilamanjaro, we both were geeking out on what kind of equipment we should get, and as many facts and bits of information as we could get on what the trip would be like. And as I said, we chose a trip that would give us the best chance of summiting, because I guess there's a little bit of competitive NT going on there of, we want, if we're going to do this, we want to do this right and actually achieve this pretty cool goal, was just getting to the top of the highest peak in Africa. And I think as well, we both had a love of systems, and we had, along with my INFP preference sister, a group we called the Book Pushers Club. And if you looked at the sorts of books that we pushed on each other, they were definitely ones that introduced you to whole realms of thinking and presented systems. And so one of my dad's favorite books was one that contrasted Islamic worldview with a Christian worldview. And he was very interested in how the world was changing and seeing the growth, both in popularity and in political clout, of people in the Islamic world. And he was not a very religious person himself. It was much more an intellectual interest in how these two philosophies would have impacted. And I'm reading a book right now that I think he would have loved, that actually centers world history on the areas around Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, the Balkans, and into Central Asia. And I think he would have found that fascinating, to say, okay, what is our system based on Christianity telling us that is a little bit weird when we consider the longer world history? Or perhaps we consider what will happen in the next millennium when we compare the age of populations in the Islamic world to the age of the populations in much of the Christian world. So there's that shared love of looking at patterns, trying to see how things fit together, trying to understand the building blocks and the logic that I think fed both of us in terms of our intuition and thinking. And we also both loved reading novels, which I found is not as common for men, but generally is quite common for INTJ men. And in fact, a lot of TJ men generally, or people who identify as male, like fiction because it allows them to get into the minds of other people without the messy stuff of actually being with those people.
Yeah, I don't have to spend time with these people to understand them. That's funny. And so, thank you, Catherine, for these distinctions between INTJ and INTP as per your relationship with your father. I think oftentimes people they know the theoretical differences, but they don't have like the tangible stories to bring it to life. So you really help the audience members bring it to life. Especially, I have people with sensing preferences in my audience asking for more examples, and so it's always nice to like hear people's real stories because it actually helps cement learning. You've added so much to the type space in your books, in the workshops you do, in the way that you impact other INTPs by representing them in type experts. So thank you.
So in your outro, the thing that really stood out to me was thinking about some of those practical differences. And my dad was lucky enough to spend nearly his whole life extremely healthy. He was part of a research study, and until his late 70s, nothing was ever wrong. I mean, he was used to thinking this was going to be his life state forever. And we had many conversations about how he would like to have a death similar to both his parents, who both went to sleep, one to a nap, one for the evening, and never woke up. Unfortunately, life did not present him with that kind of death. And instead, he developed both cancer and a heart condition. And it was very interesting to see the TE, the extroverted thinking approach to the world changing. And I've spoken many times at type conferences about my personal struggles with my health and endometriosis. And it's great that nowadays people know what endometriosis is. If I was doing this video even 10 years ago, probably I'd have to explain it. Now I'm sure people have heard quite a lot about it. And for people who haven't and have female, please take a look if you're having any real issues around your life that don't match up to those really interesting Tampax ads where they show you playing and having a great time while you have your period, because it's not like that for everyone, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's normal for you if it's not. So my approach to my chronic health problems has been to try and live with what I've got and to use the world to find support. And I've really actually leaned into extroverted feeling to reach out to people and tell them it's not a good day. I'm not doing well. And it's amazing how much you learn and how comforting it can be when someone says, wow, I really hear you. My daughter has endometriosis, or I heard about that on the news, and wow, that sounds really tough. My dad, instead, when there were suggestions about how he could make his life easier in dealing with his cancer and his heart condition, basically resented the fact that his body no longer did what he wanted it to do and what it had reliably done for 70 plus years of his life. And he struggled mightily and didn't use the opportunities that he did have to build a life for himself that would maximize what he got out for it. And I'll just give you one example. He was planning to go to Florida for a winter break. And I said, I don't know if you remember when I had my surgery, I got them to bring a cart to the check-in gate, and I rode out to the gate. I didn't waste my energy trying to walk through a crowded, airport to a distant gate. I thought, I'll save that for when I get to my destination. And his immediate reaction are, what are you trying to do? Make me an invalid? And I mean, back to our conversation about when INTPs make suggestions, they think your plan is good, going to Florida. seemed like a great idea. It might revive some of my dad's energy. And I had a suggestion that I thought would make it better. And he saw it as totally rejecting the framework of who he was and suggesting something that he didn't want, and unfortunately never was really able to face, that the reality had shifted. So sometimes that TE ability to turn on a dime fails someone when the reality is just so starkly different from what it has always been or what they would like it to be. And that may be one case where the introverted version of thinking can get down to business at getting to, okay, given this is true, what would be the most logical way to try and maximize my ability to continue on as best I can? And not that both types don't experience despair or unhappiness when the world doesn't work out. But it was very interesting to see how the stubbornness and the perseverance that had been of such value to him when he was healthy was such a hurdle, such a stumbling block to making the most of the limited time he had once he was diagnosed.
Yeah, it almost seems like a introverted feeling thing for your father too. It's almost like you're attacking my identity or who I
Mhm.
believe myself to be, like you said, by offering this possibility. So your extroverted intuition was trying to help in the parent slot, and it was totally shut
And the
down.
child FI is saying, no, that's not the kind of help I want. And then my anonymous FE feeling like, wow, I was just trying to connect, to say, look, I've had this experience of not being able to get around and it sucks. And here's something that helped me.
Yeah,
And instead, that was met with, don't make me an invalid.
yeah. He wasn't noticing your extroverted feeling. He was wrapped up in his own feelings about his suffering at that moment.
And I think probably too, a male female difference comes into play. He was of a generation where being stoic and strong, not admitting weakness was very important. And I think for better or ill, if you're raised as a female, you have to embrace a little bit more of the admitting that you can't always solve every problem. And that's probably helped a few female identifying INTPs to lean into being a little more honest and vulnerable when things aren't working for them, that might not be as available to someone with the same preferences who identifies as male.
Yeah, so gender differences really do play a role here. And so thank you, Catherine, for coming out. Thank you, audience members, for watching. We'll see you all in the next episode. Take care. Bye.